I don't have any slides, and I wish I could go like this. But I did it before I came up and nothing happened. So I'm a former print girl, so I come with dead trees. This part of the afternoon is called Explore, and I want to explore the idea of listening and the importance of conversation. I'll start by relaying two conversations. The first between two busy parents and their 3 young children. The youngest, Jesse, came home from school one day and announced that he had decided to become a vegetarian. The family, as I said, very busy. They said, oh, yikes, it's hard enough to feed a family of 5 without having to make something separate for one, but they respected his choice and they started churning out the vegetarian options. After about 7 days, they realized they had a problem. Jesse hated vegetables. His mother threw up her hands and said, Jesse, you cannot be a vegetarian if you won't eat vegetables. And Jesse burst into tears and he said, I just wanted to help the animals get better. Turns out Jesse had meant veterinarian, not vegetarian. The second conversation, that was a failed conversation. The second conversation was between a United States Navy aircraft carrier and Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in 1995. Canadians, please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Americans, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Canadians, negative. You will have to divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Americans, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand you change your course or countermeasures will be taken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, we are a lighthouse. Your call. Now, that's not just a story of perceived arrogance by Americans. It's also a good example of how we Canadians don't always explain ourselves very clearly. It's funny, but it's not a very good conversation. Almost everything I've ever worked at, newspaper reporter, radio and television producer, the Canadian Consulate in New York, and now the Walrus Foundation, has been about creating a forum for conversation, in particular, the Canadian conversation. What I learned from the legendary broadcaster Peter Zosky and journalist, now Senator Pamela Wallin and others, is that a conversation takes 2. There's no point in telling a story without a listener. One of the most important elements of the CBC radio program Morningside were the letters from listeners. 15 hours of live radio a week, conversations from coast to coast to coast. Yes, we have 3. On every subject imaginable, and sure, the listener couldn't actually join in at the time, but they sure joined in after. They kept the conversation going. It was an accepted fact that the listeners were much smarter than us, the people producing the program. Peter Zosky knew there was always someone listening, just like in this room, who knew far, far more on any given subject than he did. The conversation between Canadians was the point. Morningside was the forum. Peter just one part of the conversation. He got up every morning wondering what the listeners were thinking, what they were curious about, and how he could have a conversation that day that would satisfy them. He didn't have a message he wanted to cram down their throats. He wanted and got engagement by listening. He was all about the Canadian conversation, yet he also recognized we're enormously influenced by our neighbors to the south. He staged a contest, asking listeners to come up with the Canadian equivalent of as American as apple pie. The winner was as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. In 2002, I went down to New York to work at the Canadian Consulate. When I arrived there, I was thrilled out of my head to be doing what I perceived as very important cultural and diplomatic work. I went to my very first briefing with a senior diplomat, and he explained to me that New Yorkers just didn't care at all about anything Canadian. He said, invited them to hear Canadians speak or to meetings with Canadian business people, but New Yorkers just didn't show up. They were apparently an impenetrable wall. Canada did not register with them. I was flabbergasted by this, as was then Consul General Pamela Wallin, newly appointed. New Yorkers didn't care about Canada? I thought, well, of course they don't. Why should they? New Yorkers don't care about Kansas. So they don't care about lots of other places. So I figured, Canada, we better get in line. It appears we'd only been interested in getting our message out, telling them what we thought they should be interested in, without ever having the courtesy or curiosity to find out what they were interested in. It was a failed one-way conversation. So instead of expecting them to be curious about us, we needed to become properly curious about them. It didn't take long to discover that New Yorkers like bright and shiny things. They have more choice than anybody else in very little time. So you have to stand out to be noticed. Aha, we thought. They might not care if it's Canadian, but they will care if it's good. And careful observation also showed that New Yorkers are passionate about culture, music, art, books, the theater. Culture, we discovered, is the way into the hearts and minds of New Yorkers. It's the key to every conversation you want to have. We already knew the masters of the universe on Wall Street would not give up 10 minutes for a meeting with a Canadian premier about, say, softwood lumber. But as it turned out, they would give up 4 hours if the visiting Canadian premier invited them to see, say, Oscar Peterson or Diana Krall perform, or to see Christopher Plummer and King Lear at Lincoln Center. It worked like a charm. Suddenly, everyone was accessible to us and to Canadian ideas and assets, and there were lots of conversations going on. And suddenly, lots of New Yorkers learned that we have lots of bright and shiny things. Blackberries and diamonds, energy and beef, authors, artists, universities, and wine, and yes, some issues with softwood lumber. It turns out you get New Yorkers in the room by inviting them to experience excellence. On their way out the door, you make sure they know the art or the technology is Canadian. And during the conversation, they might also learn that actually none of the 9/11 terrorists came across the Canadian border, that Quebec has excellent cheese, that the Governor General's Award is not a military honor, and that we too have soldiers over there. And because you've listened, you've heard them explain that the anniversary of 9/11 means something to them. Even years later, no, they're not over that yet. And asking New Yorkers where they were on that September morning in 2001 is a sign of respect, that you know it was awful, that it was awful for us, too. You've listened to them tell you that as New Yorkers, they often feel like an island off America, some identifying more with what they perceive as Canadian values than they were getting from Washington at the time. You've been able to explain that we Canadians are also not a monolith. We don't always agree with our government either. And after 4 years, I came back to Canada with a deeper understanding of them, at least some of them, and they, us. And I learned that this idea, curious listening and conversation, can be applied anywhere. Conversations also tend to break down stereotypes, yours of them, and perhaps more importantly, ours of ourselves. Sure, we use stereotypes sometime, but we try to turn them on their head. Many folks that we met had this idea of Canada as a Mountie in red serge standing in front of the marine blue waters of Lake Louise, soaring Rockies in the background. So we made a postcard of that, but we put a Blackberry in the Mountie's hand. And that was in 2002. We wanted them to know, yeah, that's Canada too. As far as our stereotypes about ourselves, well, whether you like it or not, fellow Canadians, it's been a while since we were peacekeepers. A high percentage of Canadians have never been to the Arctic or have been in a canoe. Many have never seen an actual beaver, unless it's on the nickel. Even fewer have seen a walrus, which brings me to the walrus. It's a marine mammal. It's also a magazine. It's a magazine, it's in your bag. It's created for a national conversation about Canada. Why is it called the Walrus? The answer is not, as Lewis Carroll wrote, "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things," although we're not above borrowing that line. Or from John Lennon's "I am the walrus," although I am the walrus, but so are you. The answer is the founders named the magazine The Walrus to alter our view of ourselves as Canadians, to enable us to have a different kind of conversation. In other words, not the beaver, the walrus. Larger, feistier, slightly irascible, northern, even a bit smelly. No one, it was decided, could ignore a walrus, and so the walrus it became. The Canadian conversation is complicated, but even if we have differing views, and we do, they are still our views. We also have our own stories and our own heroes. Hello, Roberta Bondar. And we need our own forums so we can talk about our views and our stories. Sure, you need to know what's going on in the world, but when you read things going on in the other world, The Economist, The New Yorker, that's great. Those are great magazines, those are great forums, but they're not Canadian. When you read those things, you're missing something. You're missing you. You're a spectator. You're not in that game. Global journalism will rarely talk about you and your country, nor will they talk about the rest of the world through your eyes. They're not a forum for the Canadian conversation. They're not listening to you. I don't need to tell you that there are many places in the world right now where people are protesting and even dying for the right to have a conversation about their own future, the future of their country, for a free press, or for someone to listen. Their inability to have that conversation is having dire consequences. This is a critical time in our country's development. We've changed a lot, and conversations have never been more crucial. I have one last conversation to share. I was on holiday last week talking to an American businessman who had done business in Canada for a long time. He said, "Boy, has your country ever changed in the past 30 years? For good or for bad?" I asked. "Well," he said, "that would be for you and your fellow countrymen to decide." I listened to him and I thought, indeed, that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you.